Mapping and TQM. Thinking about thinking. After the Second World War, Americans sent Dr. J. Edwards Deming to Japan to help sort out the manufacturing industry, which was an odd mix of the medieval and industrial ages. And it was war-shattered. Deming introduced ideas, including collecting statistics from the mass production activities, making sure that each worker understood what he or she was doing, asking the workers that performed those processes to think of the way of improving them. These ideas were later developed into what we today call total quality management, TQM. The results were, we are told, extraordinary. Within a generation, Japanese industry soared and moved from building bicycles in sheds to a worldwide dominance of high-value industries like building ships, cars, and electronics. The Japanese methods were then re-imported to the West and have been institutionalized in ISO 9001, an international quality standard that businesses have spent a fortune on, and which focuses on defining procedures for everything with lots of ticking and checking. The expected benefits have not yet been seen in general. And yet, some organizations that have applied the work of Deming and his successors have seen staggering benefits. Recognizing the importance of mapping suggests another way of looking at what has happened. The sudden simultaneous release from constant threat of a totalitarian state machine, along with war trauma, which happened with a victory in the Pacific, and the peace that followed, was a beginning for a flowering economic miracle. The trauma of war could also be an effective sieve that puts many people into stress and repetition. Those who can get over it fairly quickly get on with minding their own business of mapping the world, while others are too busy packing to care for disturbing the mappers. The Japanese have a history of wars and warfare that is only balanced by the heights of spiritual advancement in the cultivation of the tradition of meditation. So, they also have methods for recovering quickly and self-altering their behavior that translate to shifts in economic improvement. So by the time Dr. Deming got to Japan, the population he was to work with was already mapping. All of them, all at once. When that worked so spectacularly, Dr. Deming and his colleagues would have naturally been impressed and so started to work on methods that the workforce could use to become even more sensible, creating thus a culture which is an industrial powerhouse but still has the hidden requirement that it only works for mappers. During the early reintroduction of Japanese methods, returning from Japan to America, and with the characteristic enthusiasm and habits of mappers, they showed the American workers how to ask interesting questions about the work, collect data, interpret the data wisely, and improve processes. They showed them how to write down a description of their jobs, look at those descriptions, and see if there might be problems lurking in there. It worked wonderfully, but again, it was accidentally teaching people mapping that had done the real work in the first instance. When the TQM ideas became widespread, the accidental teaching of mapping just got lost. The ideas were sold to the packer industry on their results, but the packer industry just couldn't see the key bits of what they'd bought, the wisdom and reflection stuff. Even a creative management of high-tech industries can be thwarted by the communication barrier. To the many of the workforce, the manifest artifacts of TQM look just like the stuff that Frederick Taylor, the father of scientific management, threw about the place. Taylor gave us mass production before we had robots, by getting people to do the robots' jobs. Perhaps That is an odd way of looking at it from the modern perspective, but at Los Alamo, they simulated spreadsheet programs by setting secretaries at grids of desks with adding machines. His slogan was "Leave your brain outside and bring your body indoors." Our culture, from schools to legislation and concepts of status, is still riddled with Taylorism. In this situation, the worst-case result of introducing TQM without an explicit understanding of mapping would be dumb Taylorism. The best will be that we are confused about why we do what we do. In some organizations, the results have been tragic. There is an obsession with micro-accounting, dumbing down and writing poorly designed job descriptions that are taken as absolute behavior tramlines. Everything has to be done on the adversarial model of packing, not the intended cooperative model of mapping. ISO 9001 auditors appear in the workplace and perform swoop raids on the paperwork, aiming to catch workers out in trivialities of paperwork regulations. Like a scene out of Kafka. In some organizations, workers become more concerned with avoiding blame for micro-violations of paperwork regulations than the work at hand, which becomes completely obscured by the intervening rituals and ceremonies. Some people actually think that this is the idea. Good TQM captures the experience in the workplace and condenses up this knowledge into lists of things that are worth considering. These checklists simply remind mappers of issues they should use their mapper common sense on. The packer corruption is to regard the job as ticking the boxes as quickly as excuses can be found to do so. How much consideration is sufficient to a packer? As the proceduralist Augie has progressed under the banner of quality in too many places, it has driven real quality, which is about doing one's imaginative best to do the best possible job for the customer, completely out of the window. Ironically, there are some organizations that have invented a kind of real proceduralism. Telephone banking companies have dropped the pretense that they are offering an intelligence service from real people and openly acknowledged the anonymous procedural nature of the business. This has allowed them to think about their procedures clearly and produce very good procedures that satisfy customers' needs 24/7 and at a low cost. This contrasts favourably in many people's eyes with an offensive counter clerk performing a caricature of a pompous Dickensian undertaker and behaving as if the ridiculous regulations he's applying are the customer's problem and not his. Very successful financial organizations recognize that there are procedures that computers do well and judgments that experienced people do well. They analyze their markets with mathematics run by the computers and leave the final calls up to the people. They can use different criteria to describe the jobs of both aspects of the overall system and evaluate the effectiveness of different algorithms and traders. This gives an opportunity to try a mapper's technique. If we have real TQM, fake TQM, and real proceduralism, could we perhaps say that there is fake proceduralism? Organizations that swear blind that they are mindless automatons while they actually indulge in a frenzy of mapping. How about the British Army's journey to Port Stanley in 1982? Remember, an army is an organization that faces particularly difficult challenges. Even those that abhor all conflict can learn how to make their world more cooperative by understanding what makes an army more cooperative. The British Army is fake procedurist. Now, that's an interesting mapper way of looking at things, because then we can look beyond the paper and the language and see what the organization does. The idea that they are all following the rules all the time makes the British Army in action hard to understand. Once we realize that there are a lot of mappers in there following the rules until the moment that they can see they won't work anymore, things get clearer. We can also compare the customs of the British Army with the US Army. The Americans have always openly preferred an approach more like the real proceduralism of the telephone bankers. They openly intend to do everything by procedure and get their mappers to write the best procedures they can, in readiness. When this works, it works very well indeed, as in the Gulf. But it is so brittle because it does not give the packers using the procedures much room to react to changing circumstances. This leads to inefficiency, as in the Grenada invasion. The lesson is simple. Without the underlying mapping, TQM turns into a black comedy. With mapping, the quality staff can educate and provoke, and the enthusiasm and joy in work that the TQM advocates talk about is nothing but general mapper high spirits. In this model, the systems thinking approach, as advocated by Peter Senge in the fifth discipline, can be seen as a collection of useful mapper concepts and techniques optimized for management problems.